Welcome to this ad hoc subcommittee review schemes of delegation. Can we go first of all to the Sederunt and Apologies, please?
Chairman, with 5 members present, Councillor Smith's disappeared. Presume apologies from Councillors Brodie and Tuckfield. There are no substitutes for them, so 5 present today.
Thank you. Do we have any declarations of interest? None. Can we go to the minute of the 16th May? As attached at page 3 and the appendix at page 5. We're happy with those minutes? Thank you. I think they will hold some bearing on the discussions as we go forward this morning, such as the remit of this committee. I would propose that this morning we go through the recommendations one at a time and just deal with the business that way. There's liable to be crossovers, but I think to try to take it all in the one bite will be all over the place and be very difficult to track. If members are happy with that. Okay, do we have a proposing second for the minute, please? Ivor, Tom, thanks very much. Any matters arising from the minute? No. Okay, let's go to agenda item 4, review schemes of delegation. The report asks members to review and make recommendations on the schemes of delegation. As I say, we'll go through each recommendation one at a time. So, recommendation at 2.1, amendments to the scheme of delegation, administration and delegation to committee as detailed at appendix 1. Any members have any points they would like to raise on that? Tom?
Just one that's actually come to light as a result of something that happened in the last week or so. Where we don't seem to have member involvement is when we get planning appeals that are determined by Scottish ministers. Now, up until about 18 months ago, all members ever knew about what had been determined was what we read in newspapers, or if one of our constituents phoned us up and said, we thought that thing had been refused, they've started building here, and then you find out Scottish minister, the company had gone to appeal and Scottish ministers had given permission. So we then got David Sutty to let members of the planning committee know if the Scottish ministers had made any determination one way or another. But the one that came in last week, there had been a recommendation by officers, which was supported by elected members, to refuse a wind farm application in Wigtonshire, I think it was. That subsequently went to appeal. The reporter found in favour of the appellant and granted permission for a wind farm with conditions. The person then came back to the council asking us as a planning committee to change one of the conditions because he didn't like conditions the reporter had put on. And we said, no, we're not willing to do that because the reporter gave you permission, therefore we're not going to vary that. He then went back to the reporter again. We turned round and said, I'm not prepared to vary that either, and indeed the original reporter should not have granted you planning permission. Now, this raises a very serious issue of where elected members get, and David Sutty's advice in his email was, probably don't think this is worth further action. But there is no report back to elected members or for elected members to make a decision as to whether we want to take this further. Because if you've got one reporter for the Scottish minister saying, I'm granting permission for this, and then a second reporter 3 months down the line says, I'm not going to vary the thing, and in fact, I doubt whether the first reporter should have given permission. So could we have somewhere that appeals that go to Scottish ministers are reported back to the Planning Applications Committee, and indeed, in an instance like this, it should be for the committee to take advice and determine whether they want to take it further. I mean, it's all very well David Sutty saying to individual members of the planning committee, I don't think it's worth pursuing, but it is an interesting case. I think that's something that should come to committee and for the members to determine, perhaps based on legal advice rather than planning advice. Because it is a very anomalous situation where our officers refuse, we as councillors refuse, a reporter says it's okay, and then a second reporter said, no, the first report was wrong, I deal with what the council did in the first instance was the correct way to proceed. And it's whether we want to make a formal complaint to Scottish ministers about the conduct of a particular reporter. So I think we need to put something into our standing orders about a report back to the Planning Applications Committee about appeals that go to the Scottish report.
Thanks, Chairman. I wasn't aware of the anomalous situation. I'll look into that. I think that does merit further consideration by the Planning Committee. I think, yes, we will bring back reports to the Planning Committee. I wrongly had assumed that that would be happening anyway. I don't think you need to amend your standing orders. I'll just make that an administrative requirement that in future, when an appeal is determined by Scottish ministers, it's reported back to the next Planning Committee. We'll put that in train this afternoon after this meeting. And I will come back to members on the anomalous situation which appears to have arisen. Are you telling us it's a lottery as to which reporter you get?
It rather puts the council in a invidious situation when you're caught between two reporters. But happy with those assurances. Okay, anything else on Ivor?
Chair, it's just clarify a point for myself. Under page 19, we have the committees there. I may be reading this wrong, but I thought we had sort of proposed that there would be an additional committee because it comes in the delegations to committee later on page 24, Community and Customer Services Committee. There's no reference to it in paragraph 3.4. I don't know whether it's a case of you can't put it in until you've agreed it or whether the draft it will come later.
A wee bit of housekeeping there, I think, Leader. I think if members agree to the amendments, then we'll tidy the document up and represent it to you as a final version for you to consider.
Chairman, it's just my bad editing.
Colin?
But that's been the excuse for things over the years. It's not a big change, but it's just, I would like to see the word strengthened a wee bit on page 30, 5.9.10, and that's in terms of the role of area committees when it comes to the input, if you like, into major developments and initiatives within that locality. It kind of implies that if there was a consultation, then they would be able to take part in it. But sometimes there's not a consultation, and that's actually the issue more than anything else. I come back to the issue that it took the chair of Nithsdale Area Committee quite a lot of effort just to get that committee to be allowed to discuss the issue around the Dumfries Learning Town project. That's a massive development taking place that has a particular impact on people living in Nithsdale, yet it wasn't at any time on the agenda of any Nithsdale Area Committee until the actual chair insisted it would be. You know, so even though you had an education performance report, it astonishingly excluded mentioning it, and the chair had to get that rectified, basically. So what the aim of trying to change the role of area committee was, at the moment, the big issue with area committees is that, frankly, they don't do a great deal apart from hand out grants. Now and again, they do performance report, and the extent to which that influences anything, well, time will tell. But when it comes to major initiatives and developments, they need to have a very formal role, I think, and the responses from the area committees need to be reported back to the relevant service committee, in my view. I mean, the prime example, this council spent a fortune on consultants to come up with proposals for Burn Statue because they didn't properly consult the area committee and the people actually knew the area and knew what local residents wanted to see. We ended up wasting that money because the plans got completely changed. Maybe if the area committee had been involved at an earlier stage or in a continual stage, then that would have been avoided and a lot of money would have been saved, basically. So I would like to see that firmed up to make sure that the area committee is consulted properly on major initiatives and developments within that area, and the results and the views of the area committees are contained in the report back to the relevant service committee to make sure that there's, it's not missed.
So it's essentially to have clarity around the basis for determining when a consultation takes place and ensuring that that consultation is reported appropriately back to area committees, who in turn feed back to the relevant parent committee.
The committee have to be reported back. I mean, I don't know whether the trigger mechanism is the area committee choose which items they want to input into service committees on, or vice versa, but I just think that it's important that we actually have that clarified, how that will work in practice. We've had changes to the member officer protocol in relation to the involvement of members in ward issues, and I think as we've seen last week over the discussions around the East Ayrshire Partnership, that frankly doesn't seem to have changed much. So I just want to be absolutely clear what this will mean in practice, and at the moment it's a wee bit kind of lacking in detail.
Happy to take these comments on board leader and find a form of words for paragraph 5.9.10. As I say, once members have had deliberated on this, we'll bring this document back for final approval to recommend to full council. So I fully understand what Councillor Smith's saying, and we can do that. We'll incorporate that.
At the present time, who is it that would make the decision about whether a public consultation was going to take place and on what basis?
It's normally done in accordance with the national standards of community engagement, and it would be if a committee had a proposal going forward, it would determine that there was to be public consultation in accordance with the national engagement requirements, and that consultation would then form part of the report back to that committee. I think what Councillor Smith is requesting and suggesting is that area committees be involved in that consultation process, not only involved in it, but see the outcome of the consultation and then make a firm recommendation as an area committee back to the service committee which originated the project. That's maybe a roundabout way of saying it, but we'll find a form of words which hopefully will address these concerns.
I think it's appropriate that the area committee have input into the rationale that comes back off of any consultation, and to ratify that, to come back to the appropriate committee. Ivor?
Chair, it's to do with 5.10 and 5.12, possibly linking into 6. We have the local review body and civic government licensing panel. Now, they are, local review bodies are a panel of the 19 members of the plan, or 11 members of the plan application committee, and there is a group drawn from that. There's a report going to civic government licensing with regard to the panels that have to sit to look at as proportional. Now, if you take the panel, it's a selection of 7 members from the main group. That excludes some members from actually being on there. Now, my understanding, both of those sort of things were non-political, so that although the main committee is made up from a proportionality, when you come down to the local review body and the actual panel that sits, I don't think those should be proportional. They should be non-political items that are sort of quasi-judicial things. And I would have thought that that report that's going next week could cause issues in the future.
Mr. Hazel?
I'll need to have a look at that report. My understanding is the same as the leaders. The Councillors' Code of Conduct specifically states that you shouldn't be politically partisan when you're considering planning applications or indeed licensing applications. So I think Mr. Crichton and I will have a wee look at that report and perhaps provide some advice. If members want to specifically say in the scheme of delegation that these panels do not require to be on a proportionate basis, we can fit that into the document if that's what members wish.
Chairman, if I may, the subcommittee that the leader's referring to is a subcommittee of the panel to look at consultation documents, not to sit as in a hearing as such. No.
I think
That's my
maybe-
understanding.
I think that's maybe slightly different in that if it's a consultation document, it may be that members would want to form a view on it on the basis of proportionality. I'll have a look at the report and maybe bring it back to members.
Thank you, Tom.
I think Ivor's correct there, because actually the local review body usually consists of 5 elected members, and therefore with 5 elected members being chosen out of a panel of 19, then you would never have a non-aligned member on a 5-member. Indeed, you never have a non-aligned member on a 7-member committee, and most of the licensing decisions are made by a 7-member committee, and therefore, although you have a non-aligned member in a 19-member panel, you can never ever be on a 7-man subcommittee. And I think it always has been the case that matters of licensing, planning, because they're quasi-judicial, they never are covered by the Act. But I think the one thing maybe needs to be done is an annual report on attendance, because that's sometimes, particularly on the licensing side, there's a view out there with tax operators that seem to see the same faces appearing, and they seem to be the hangmen rather than more reasonable members. So it might it might well be an idea, because although I'm not casting aspersions on anybody, but although there are 19 members on the licensing panel, you're permanent any 7 from 19. It'd just be interesting to see at the end of the year how many have actually attended. Now, do bear in mind some members, because of work commitments, can't always attend. It'd be quite interesting to see the number of attendances per member. And the same with the review body as well. I think it's got the same problem. So I think we need to see the attendances on these. And that would dispel viewpoint out there, particularly on the taxi licensing side.
The minutes of all of these meetings are a matter of public record, and I don't know that a register of attendance is necessarily essential in those circumstances. I'm sure if any operator of whatever discipline has got any difficulties, that if they bring it to the attention of the council, it would be appropriately addressed. Certainly wouldn't like to think that we're being accused of putting up hanging juries. Any other points any members would like to raise? Councillor Scobie.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for allowing me to address the committee. It's really on item 7 of the standing orders in terms of the scheme of delegation and the practice where anyone tabling a motion that full council requires to, or the council requires to withdraw its delegation. I think in sitting, looking round the table to the members present, I don't think there has been any one member here who has not been involved in tabling a notice of motion at full council.
Sorry, Willie, if I can just point out, we're working our way through the recommendations individually rather than bounce about from pillar to post and get lost most likely in the process. So we're concentrating on 2.1 at this point in time. Thank you. Is there any other points that members would like to raise on 2.1 of the recommendations? Would you like a resume from Claire on the topics discussed thus far? I think that would be helpful just for clarification. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Chairman. The issue was raised about reporting back to the Planning Applications Committee about appeals that go to Scottish ministers, but we'll take that on board as an admin requirement rather than something to be included in standing orders. The role of area committees, the 5.9.1, we need to strengthen that in terms of the formal role and major initiatives, consultation role. The area committees get involved at an early stage, so we'll choose some appropriate words to strengthen that up a bit. National standards of engagement, Alec mentioned, so we'll go in line with that. Comments about the LRB and the licensing panel. They're obviously non-political when they set hearings of the panel and the board. I think the issue was the subcommittee that's going to be formed from the licensing panel is there to look at the review of taxi licensing. So it's a consultation subcommittee rather than one that's there to sit in formal hearing. But I'll have a word with Alec about that. I think that was really only comments that were put forward in relation to the scheme of delegation to committees.
Thanks, Claire. Members quite happy that we've addressed the recommendation at 2.1. Move on now to recommendation 2.2 to note further delegations included in the scheme of delegation to officers as detailed at Appendix 2. Members, any questions to raise on this? Content with Appendix 2, Tom?
I think in fairness, certainly my group, we were more intent on looking at the committee side of things at this stage. Hadn't really paid a great deal of attention to delegation for officers. But I assume this would come back next year anyway, because we're duty bound to review our standing orders, etc., every year in any case. That gives another year to look at it. It would be helpful to know exactly what... we as elected members, as a council, delegate things to committees. We also delegate matters to officers. We then delegate the other officers, kind of the bigger please, give stuff to the weir please, and so on and so forth. But it'd be nice to know what statutory duty officers have and what are delegated duties. In fact, it's probably easier to list the statutory duties and start from there.
8.
I was just to say, Chairman, that obviously the Excel spreadsheets are not perhaps in the most user-friendly form, so it was just to give you an indication of what we hold, or the proper officer holds, in terms of the further delegations beyond that, goes to directors, etc. But we will put it in a kind of better format. Obviously, things have moved on since we've got these delegations in terms of community and customer services. So they are a working document. But it's just to let members see that we do have them, they do exist, and we'll maybe put them in a better format than they are presented here today.
Thank you. Colin?
Has anybody done, I mean, it's a big piece of work, but even just with our neighbouring councils that we sort of cross-check things with, has anybody done a piece of work on how our scheme of delegation compares to other local authorities? I think Tom's making a valid point that there's two types of delegation. There's a delegation that's a statutory delegation to an officer, but there's also a delegation that councillors have effectively given to an officer over the years. And it'd be good to distinguish between the two, and it's quite difficult, I think, to distinguish between the two in the document. But I'm also interested to know to what extent other local authorities, how far they go with their scheme of delegation as well, and how does ours compare to them. It's obviously, I'm not asking you to sit down and go through every scheme of delegation, every local authority in Scotland, just to tick the boxes, but I just wonder if there's anything stands out that we've delegated, or rather not delegated, in comparison to other local authorities. I think that's maybe a starting point, and then we then have to have a discussion as to whether it's appropriate to delegate that.
So it's basically what examination has taken place in comparative councils and the way that they conduct business. Claire?
I don't think ours is too dissimilar to other authorities. In terms of the general delegations, they are pretty similar. I think the ones that you're referring to, Councillor Smith, we need to make it clear what is a statutory delegation and what's delegated through committee decisions. So that's maybe not abundantly clear from the Excel spreadsheets, but I don't think we're really that much different from other authorities. We did do a trial of them way back in the midst of time. So.
We can certainly have a look at other authorities' websites. We'll pick 3 or 4 of similar size and similar geography, etc., and just have a quick look. The statutory delegations, there's statutory appointments which the council make, and they're on page 42 of the document. That's where the council actually determine which officer is to be the proper officer for specific statutory duties imposed on the council. We've then got the general delegations, which are set out, and they tend to be very wide-ranging delegations. We will have another look at those, and as Claire says, we'll have a look at the Excel spreadsheet that we've got here and see if we can look at the further delegations, because you delegate to a director to undertake a certain amount of work. For example, let's say the director responsible for environmental services. has the delegation, or his head of service has the delegation, then there is a further delegation required, because if we go into a court situation on an environmental health issue or an environmental services issue, the first thing the defence solicitor asks the officer who's in court is, where does your power emanate from to bring my client to court? And the answer is, well, I have a delegation from the head of service has a delegation from the director has a delegation from the council. The council has a statutory duty to do it, and there's an audit trail through there. So we'll try and firm up on that. It would be impossible to give you a spreadsheet with everybody who has a delegated power on it, I'm afraid. We tried to review the scheme of delegation, I think 2.5, 3 years ago, in terms of officers, and even in gathering the information from departments proved problematic. But we think we've nailed it down now.
Thank you, Colin.
The only other point was I couldn't quite work out from the document the extent of the delegation, sort of financial powers and expenditure. I wasn't entirely clear what decisions have to be made by a committee when it comes to expenditure and what decisions can be legitimately made by officers when it comes to expenditure. There was an example of the policy and resources in relation to the funding of the stove, and I asked a question there when Planning, House and Environment Services had agreed to award effectively what was £49,000, and I was told they had done it. Now, frankly, I can't find that anywhere in any minute. Now, it may very well be that the decision just to agree that there's X amount of £1 million to go to economic development as me made a decision that can then be spent as and when officers see fit. So I'm not entirely clear. I notice there's delegation in relation to grants of up to £20,000 to businesses, but I'm not entirely clear. And I think at a time we've got to scrutinise every single financial decision as carefully as we possibly can. It seems to me there's lots of money being spent, and the extent to which committees are making those decisions is sometimes lost to me. I think sometimes when you say, right, we're going to go off and do a scheme, then that effectively gives a blank cheque almost to spend almost anything on that particular scheme sometimes, just because there's a budget line somewhere hidden in the budget, basically. So I'm not entirely clear what comes to committees when it comes to expenditure and what actually is delegated to officers.
Are you suggesting then that should maybe form part of the committee report that comes to members?
We made absolutely clear how it actually works in practical terms, what the figures are, and what actually constitutes a decision to effectively authorise a spending commitment. Sometimes the figures are never there, but the commitment's given because a committee has been asked to agree a particular item, no figures almost, and that then effectively gives permission to go off and spend almost what you like within the line. It sticks within the council's 300 million budget.
Mr. Harswell?
That wouldn't be addressed through the scheme of delegation. That's addressed through the financial regulations. And if members want to get a paper back to this subcommittee which would look at that, I'm quite happy for Paul Garrett to do a piece of work on that. But the financial regulations specifically set out what officers can and can't do in terms of their delegated powers. It's a fairly large document. So what I'll do is I'll get Paul Garrett maybe to come and speak to the subcommittee about that with a wee paper, and we could maybe clarify that at that point.
I think that clarity would be helpful. Okay, any other questions under 2.2? No? Claire, if you could give us a brief rundown on that, thanks.
Chairman, just we'll come back to the subcommittee just to lay out a bit more clearly what's delegated to officers in terms of statutory delegations and those that are being determined by the committees. Mentioned about clarification on what's delegated to officers and what's a member's decision in terms of financial decisions, which are covered by the financial regs. So we'll invite the head of finance to the next meeting just to go through these financial regs. The members are clear on that position.
Okay, members happy with that? Go on to recommendation 2.3. Any members, any questions? Retain a scheme of appointments to roles and organisations to include only those that are not set up and administered by the council, and give consideration to the governance and reporting arrangements for council-led forums and groups, particularly with regard to regeneration activity. Richard?
Yeah, there's certainly need for rationalising the bodies which the council set up for, for example, the master plan groups such as Annan Regeneration Steering Group. It was set up as a method of engaging with the community, and it involved the community members, but it didn't have any governance rules to apply to it, how the chairman was elected, who could be members of the group, and last year there was a decision made that all the meetings should be held in private, which seemed to go against the nature of the group, which was to engage with the public. And it meant that certain privileged people within the community had access to confidential information, which seemed, and some of these people were business people, it seemed all wrong. So it needs clear guidelines of how these groups operate.
Thank you. Certainly your points are taken on board, and an all-embracing or encompassing consultation is what the council seeks to have, so that it's totally inclusive of all members of the community and that all information available to one is available to all. Any other points?
I mean, just on the regeneration stuff, one of the issues around that, I mean, we didn't support some of these regeneration organisations because, frankly, we wanted something with a bit more teeth. And I think if you look at the Dumfries Town Centre Forum in particular, you look at the attendance level from the community to those meetings, it's pretty low now, because I think people have came along, realised it doesn't seem to have any input into council decisions, and therefore they just haven't came back. You know, but it is a worthwhile forum that we need to discuss with local businesses, we need to discuss with community councils. In fact, we need to do a lot more of that, not less. And I'd be worried that this would be an excuse, just because of the pressures on officers' time, that we simply get rid of some of these organisations just because we haven't got time to run them, and then we end up making bad decisions that there's a public backlash against because we haven't consulted. So I think they need to be there. I think they need to be improved. I think one of the improvements is that there appears to be no report back mechanism whatsoever between what's discussed at these meetings and what's then discussed at the relevant service committee. So in all the years I've been going to Dumfries Town Centre Forum, not a single line that's ever been discussed there has ever been referred to in a report. Now, maybe alluded to in something else, and that may be where the idea may have came from or otherwise, but you'd have thought there would have been a report back mechanism whereby it would have been referred to in a report that this meeting had taken place and this was the views of the forum. And if that was to happen, then maybe the people who don't go to the forum might actually see that this is a way to try to influence council decisions. And I don't understand why simple things like the minutes of these meetings that are taken are not contained in the council website. I don't know why they're not reported, maybe the minutes to the actual relevant service committee, and that'd be one way to actually scrutinise whether these groups are actually working to actually report the minutes to the relevant service committee.
Thank you. I think that consistency across all of these consultations and how the council presents itself at these forums and the clarity around the reporting back, and that something meaningful is done with the information that's gleaned as a result, is appropriate. Is there any comment, Claire? Alec?
I think the points that members are making, we've been conscious for a long time that there are a plethora of groups set up. There are groups which have been running for 10, 11 years and nothing appears to come out of them. I think the first thing we need to do is to go through and look at a scheme and bring a scheme back to members. We'll certainly take on board the issue of ensuring that there's proper reporting back. If a group is meeting and is not having any report back to the council committee, I would question why it's bothering to meet, quite frankly. There are groups that meet simply for the sake of meeting because of aid in it, and I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good thing either. So we really need to look at all these groups. We'll bring a fairly comprehensive report back to members on what we've got. I think we do need member input into this, however, because it can become very political, and it's no for an officer to say this group is no longer required. That would be a member decision.
Thank you. Colin?
Can't comment on groups in other parts of the region. I can only comment on the ones that I attend, but I would hope that when we're doing that piece of work, we'll speak to those people within the groups themselves and get their view. That they don't. I mean, there was a obviously a lot of concern that these groups appear to have almost unilaterally been stopped, and the people who are actually involved in the groups weren't aware this had happened. In fact, certainly the Town Centre Forum one, I can't remember the last time it actually met, but we need to speak to the people in those groups and get their feedback on it. Do they think it's worthwhile? What would they like to see put in place? And that should form part of the report, because if the aim of the exercise is to consult with key stakeholders, in the case of Dumfries Town Centre, it's the businesses, etc., then we need to find out what input they would like and how they would like that to work, and that should form part of the report, as well as obviously the views of councillors.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, it doesn't directly fall on from that, but same sort of thing. So we're going to get report backs for some of these groups. We tie in with something I was asked about. At the moment, a member of the public can go onto the council website. They can look up their local member. They can see that they've what committees they're on, what outside bodies they're on. They can see that they've attended, say, 55 meetings of the council out of 59. That's fine. They don't know how many meetings outside bodies they've attended. Now, I do note that in Appendix 3, we do have a linked officer for every outside body. If that link officer could keep a record of attendances, because if they're getting minutes from these bodies, they can easily pick out the attendances of elected members at these bodies, and that gives you a bit of transparency. And I would ask that that be done. If we keep records of us members attending council committees, there should be a record of attendance at outside bodies, and I think that would be only fair and transparent, and I would ask for that to be done.
Okay, thank you. Rob?
Thanks, Chairman. I mean, we might be surprised to discover how many bodies actually do submit minutes, in all honesty. Now, we can't possibly know that until the question is asked, which in itself is a very sensible reason for asking it. I know you were wanting to avoid the possibility of jumping backwards and forwards, but it strikes me that when we're looking at what outside bodies the council wishes to appoint members to, we could do a lot worse than go back to the role description and actually try and work out to what extent the appointment of a member to an outside body actually is in line with the fundamental basic councillor's role description. I mean, is it simply being done because when a body was established 10 years ago or longer, it was seen to be a nice idea? Sometimes, obviously, it will be laid down in statute. I'm thinking of educational trusts, for example, although they now vary dramatically in their level of utility. I mean, the Stewardship Educational Trust has very little money left, for example, and yet it has a very large committee by comparison with the amount of money that it's now able to disperse. You've got, supposing, to use another example, the Dalbeattie Community Initiative, there's a representative on that, which is appointed by the Stewardship Area Committee. It happens to be me. It's a very worthy organisation that I'm quite happy to attend, and probably would have done so irrespective of the fact I was appointed to it. But I have to be, entirely frank that in 6 years it's never been entirely clear just what addition or what benefit, either to the organisation or to the Stewardship Area Committee, having a member appointed by the committee to that body actually entails. Because almost always, in fact, without fail, when something comes up before the Stewardship Area Committee, the person that's appointed to it by that committee has got to declare an interest and get out. And yet that's the one person on the committee, because they take the trouble to attend, who would actually know more about what's going on. So it does seem to be a rather curious situation. Whose views are you representing when you're there, the area committees or the initiatives? And in any case, you can't stay in the room when things are being discussed. So I certainly welcome the idea that we need to look at that more carefully. I think probably referring back to the basic role description and what it is that any elected member who's appointed to any outside body is actually being asked to do by this council would probably be a good start.
Thank you. Any members, any other questions or points they'd like to raise? Richard?
Yeah, just like there could be a check made of, we're talking about whether we've had minutes from these bodies, but I've been appointed to 2 organisations. I haven't had, and so that's about a year ago, and I still haven't had any agendas or invitations to meeting yet. So if that's happened to me, maybe it's happening to other councillors as well. So the other point I would like to make is that we need some sort of clarity on members taking up positions where there's a conflict of interest. I think perhaps I need advice. Members are needing advice on that and consistency across the council. One of the outside bodies I was appointed to, I had to sign a declaration that I didn't have a conflict of interest. That seems to only apply to one department. I think it's the social work or education department on that. The one that's, and particularly as far as Arundel and Eskdale Area Committee, there are, I think there's 12 appointments to this Chapel Cross site stakeholder group, but there might be an apparent conflict of interest because two of the members actually work on site at Chapel Cross. So I think we need some guidance on that, whether there's a conflict of interest, and revise back on there.
I think all the points that you raised go back to the point that Rob was raising, that we're looking at roles and descriptions and responsibilities of elected members and the rationale around that, and how we take these outside bodies into account in terms of the elected member's role there. Tom?
So it ties in what I first started talking about, because if you've got these link officers there, they should be receiving copies of minutes from these organisations. So I think for a review next year, let's write to all these organisations, telling them they must send their minutes into the relevant link officer, detailed in there, because that's the only way they could ever keep a record of members' attendance at these outside bodies. And if it gets to the stage where some of them aren't even meeting or aren't submitted minutes, that might make it easier to winnow them out, the ones that are actually operating. So I think there are a number in there. Keep appointing folk to them, but they seem to meet as and when. They don't meet on a regular basis. And they may well have outlived their usefulness. So it might well be a good way of monitoring them. If we ask them to send their minutes in to the named officer there, and that would give us a basis of having a thorough overhaul next year.
I'm sure that really fits within the remit to the link officer to ensure that those minutes do come forward at the appropriate times, and that any organisation that the council supports should be seen to be operating inclusively and effectively. And if that's not the case, then the link officer should advise the council of the fact that organisation maybe isn't worthy of the level of support that it's historically been receiving, but that's an examination of what's actually going on out there. Any other points? Colin?
It's primarily on how we actually appoint members of these organisations. There was obviously a significant change in the approach taken by the council, certainly only been a council in 2007, but speaking to colleagues, the approach that was taken after the last election is very different from previous approaches, and a direct result of that approach, I noticed that a large number of vacancies still haven't been filled, so there's clearly a lack of interest despite a major desire to appoint people to these. I think there are very different types of outside organisations. I think there are strategic outside organisations where the basis of proportionality should apply. I think things like the partnerships that we've got with other organisations, community partnerships, or sort of strategic partnerships it's now called, things like COSLA, etc., they should by definition be proportional because they are strategic committees. And I think it's absolutely crazy that this council will not have somebody in the room effectively when the largest group in COSLA are debating how they're going to vote on a particular issue. This council in this area is weakened by virtue of the fact we don't have somebody in the room. I'll give you an example. COSLA will have to take a position on how the Scottish Government wishes to allocate flood prevention money quite soon. We have got a vested interest as a local authority to make sure that we get that funding coming to Dumfries and Galloway. That will only happen if they continue with a process whereby major projects are given grants rather than simply distributing the money to every council in Scotland in a proportional way. That debate's being had at the moment within COSLA. Whenever the Labour group frankly may take a position on that in COSLA, there won't be a single Labour councillor from Dumfries and Galloway in the room. So I don't want any councillors in this region talking about Dumfries and Galloway being disenfranchised when actually it's this council that's voted to disenfranchise this local authority from COSLA by virtue of the decision that we made. So I find that absolutely crazy. So I think we have to have a position whereby we actually, at the very least, make sure that we follow the guidance given to us, and the guidance from COSLA is very clear. It's very much supported by the Scottish Government Minister for Local Authority, for Local Government, who's been very critical of councils for not following that particular guidance. So I think we have to have regard for that. And likewise, when it comes to community partnerships as well, we should be looking at proportionality. When it comes to others that are clearly not strategic, non-political, then I think they should be open to every single councillor in the region, and we shouldn't have a situation which we had previously, whereby people were effectively selected before the start of a meeting. It sends a poor signal to some of these outside organisations. I know that a number I've spoken to were quite concerned about what that actually means, and I think one of the women's aid groups in particular, sort of raised an issue that their fear is that if people are appointed to outside bodies by virtue of being almost, if you like, a political appointment of a political group, then what does that actually mean for their involvement in that outside body? Their concern is if they don't, frankly, toe the line, they'll simply get removed from that outside body, and they were very uncomfortable working with the council as a partner on that basis, that they were perceived as effectively being political appointments rather than, frankly, the consensus that we've always achieved, where people can put their name forward that are interested in these bodies, and actually at no time can I remember in 2007 there actually been a vote in some of these outside bodies. If it was very rare that would happen, but I think there was a great deal of consensus. I remember one occasion when I think Councillor Charters was nominated by as the Armed Forces champion, if you like, and somebody else nominated Archie or suggested Archie, and John simply said, well, I'm quite happy for Archie to do it. That sort of consensus is the way we should be appointing people to some of these organisations, not some sort of political slate, and I think that needs to change. And I do think we need to distinguish between what are strategic organisations that should be proportional and what are other organisations that should be open to all councillors to put their name forward, and maybe some of the issues over the fact that a lot of these organisations don't have people turning up at them and they've still got a large number of vacancies, that would be tackled if that was to happen.
Thank you. Noted. And I'm happy to share that with North Lanarkshire and others. Any other? Richard?
Yeah, just that when we're appointing people, I think we try to join up things. For example, I picked up one example where I think it was the appointment to the Prestwick Airport Consultation Committee, and that seems to be tied in with the work which the board of West Strands does. But perhaps it should be a member of West Strands that's on that. But at the moment it's not.
There's a specific remit. I know about this one simply because I have an interest myself, which I don't need to be clear. Prestwick Airport Consultative Committee isn't talking about the actual transport issues at Prestwick Airport. It's talking about the flight paths of planes and the effect that the planes and the various other parts of Prestwick Airport have on the west coast of Scotland, and that's why it's a West Coast member who's been appointed, sir.
Okay, no other points, members. Can I ask Claire just to run through that, please?
Thanks, Chairman. A bit of discussion there. I'm going to come back with a report on arrangements for proper governance and reporting mechanisms for council-led groups and initiatives. Just mentioned about attendance in outside bodies that are not council-led. These details aren't on Dumgal, but the link officers should keep these attendance details in the interests of openness and transparency. And also I think we need to look at outside bodies in general as to whether members perhaps should be on them at all. Is it by dint of history, or is it actually a requirement in terms of their role as an elected member? A lot of these outside bodies don't appear to have any invites to meetings or minutes from them, so we need some clarity. I mean, there's a conflict of interest as well, need guidance on that. And I think we need to get in touch with the link officers just to make sure that actually some of these outside bodies still exist and do require elected member representation.
Colin?
And final point, I think also we have to be clear when guidance is issued to the council and how they should appoint outside bodies, and be clear when this council chooses to ignore it. But I think it also helps when it comes to the clarity of why certain people are appointed to outside bodies as well. We are asked sometimes to agree the appointment, but actually, if you were to read the constitution of the organisation, we don't really have any choice. Some people are appointed to, and I understand we have to agree that we recognise that outside body in terms of the scheme of delegation, and that allows councillors to claim their travel expense and all that. We have to agree that. But we're sometimes asked to agree the appointment of members to an outside body, even though, frankly, we don't have any choice but to appoint those individual members because it's in the constitution of the organisation. I think the ones in Lockerbie, for example, one of the trusts there by definition of their constitution, it is the members from that ward that are on it. Therefore, why are we at it? But when it comes to recommendations to committee, we're asked to agree that membership, as if I've got any choice but to say that, well, frankly, I've no problem with those members being on it. It makes absolute sense. But I can't move a motion to say they shouldn't be on it or somebody else should be on it, because actually we don't have the power to do that. And I think we have to be absolutely clear when it comes to these situations. We should be noting they're the members, but we shouldn't be being asked to agree or otherwise, because we don't actually have the power not to agree that they're the members. We have the power to agree whether or not we recognise they should go, but I don't think we should. I think it should be absolutely clear there's a distinction between who we choose to appoint and who, frankly, are almost, if you like, appointed by virtue of the constitution of the organisation, and we don't distinguish between the two.
I'm happy to take that comment on board, sir, and without entering the political debate at all, I think the issue of what are strategic outside organisations and what are non-strategic outside organisations, I think we should be bringing that forward to members, but not entering the political debate. Please don't think I'm doing that, because I think non-strategic organisations, their minutes could go to the appropriate area committee, and any reports back to the appropriate area committee, whereas the strategic ones would presumably report back to the service committees or policy and resources. But we'll try and tease that out in the thing. I also think that, yes, Councillor Smith's quite right. We've always taken the view that we needed an active decision of the council to make appointments, and that was basically for, as Councillor Smith alluded to, travelling, etc. It also ensures that if, God forbid, the member is involved in an accident on the way to a meeting of an outside body, the council's insurers will cover them. But I'll find a way around that, and we'll maybe just put a note up to a committee saying, these are all the appointments, can you note these? These have to be appointed from these wards. So we'll certainly look at that.
Thank you. I think in there, again, it's been emphasised the essential nature of the feedback that a link officer should be responsible for, and the feedback to the council on the relevance or otherwise of the operation of any organisation, and the council's part in that. Okay, with those additional notes, are we happy to move on to recommendation 2.4? On 2.4, as detailed, Standing Order 13, 7.4 in the report, I'm happy for Councillor Scobie to make a submission in this regard. So, Councillor Scobie.
Again, thank you, Chair, for allowing me to address the committee. I think I reached the stage when I interrupted you, not realising you're taking it bit by bit, so I do apologise for that. I think I was saying that from looking round the room, there would not be one member who at some point in time had not been involved in the submitting of a motion to full council for consideration of one kind and another. So it does affect those in the room and indeed the 47 members. As it says in 7.4, Chair, where it is determined by a majority of members present and voting at a council meeting not to remove delegated powers, I would say, cynically, that's, in not removing, it's a way of killing the motion at birth almost, which is not, in my opinion, good practice or indeed reflects true democracy and not allowing it. And I know when I was a member of the Labour group, it was common practice, and I still think it's the case, that they at least allow for the motion to be heard by removing the delegated powers, whether indeed the motion is agreed or not, or the group agrees or not with the particular motion. So I think that is good practice in allowing that, and that's why I go on to say, if it is the case that the motion is not allowed under the current, then it should, in my opinion, as it says in the next part of the motion, be referred back to the Service Committee for consideration. In the 7.2, there's a divergence of view where the first part says, and that is exactly what the motion is asking, that the could be seen as the full council referring the matter back to the committee. That is what's being asked, back to the Service Committee. Whereas in the second part of 7.2, where it does not allow the notice of motion either to be submitted direct to the committee, subcommittee or a committee, or that non-withdrawal of delegation of full council means that it falls to be considered, then that's the practice. If we don't remove delegated powers, that it does fall and it goes nowhere. In 7.3, it tries to address the issue, you know, to allow notice of motion to be submitted to committees would undermine the scheme of administration and delegation to committees and mean that a committee could be asked to review its own decision. There are safeguards in there. So you know, if the author had actually read, there are safeguards in that we amended standing orders some time ago on the 6-month rule. So we did. So the safeguard, that cannot happen because of the 6-month rule, and there would be a determination by the chair as to the competence of that under the 6-month rule. So there is a safeguard in there, in the standing orders, for that not to happen, as is portrayed in 7.3. So basically, Chair, as I've alluded to, members in here have been involved, and many of the 47 have been involved in the moving or submitting of a motion. If the council is not of a mind to consider the motion at full council, then I believe it should be, and do not wish to move delegated powers, then the motion is clear. It should go back to the service committee, hence the request to change standing orders. There is a point, Chair, and it could be that the individual or the two members moving the motion, as it has to have two members anyway, a mover and seconder, they could revert back to, as is stated in, I think it's 7.3, that they could ask the director or the proper officer for a report and not submit the motion. You would not have sight of the motion, is the point I'm making. And on asking for the proper officer to come forward with a report, then, on that report being provided, then move the motion, and it would be considered by that committee on the back of the report. This way, it's open, it's transparent, you can see the motion, and I believe that's the proper way to go, rather than, as the practice just now, and just killing it at birth. In my opinion, that's a cynical way of doing it, and not good for democracy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any members, any points you'd like to raise? No? Colin?
I mean, it's a part solution to an issue, but frankly, it's a kind of messy solution to an issue. There's a more direct solution, which is to allow people to put motions to committees. I don't agree, and I think Councillor Scobie's mentioned that effectively asked them to review decisions because the 6-month rule kicks in. It should kick in at committee level as well. It's a kind of bizarre thing that you go to, and it happens at the moment because very often things are referred back to the committee from full council. It's a kind of bizarre thing that if you want to raise something at committee, you have to go via the full council. Now, we've got a full council meeting in September, but had that special meeting not been arranged, the next full council meeting would have been, what was it, November, I think? So if somebody wanted to raise an issue, say, at PH&E, they would have to put a motion to the November meeting of the full council, then get rejected, you wouldn't remove delegated powers, then get referred to maybe the January meeting of PH&E. It's a kind of roundabout way to actually raise a particular issue, and I don't understand why we don't have a direct route to raise motions at service committees. Or the alternative is to have a far more formal structure when it comes to the criteria around, you can ask the proper officer to bring a report to a committee. I don't know how that works in practical terms. If I go up to an officer and say, I want a report on such, and he says no, well, that's the end of it. So what's the actual process? I don't really know what the process is.
In terms of the facts, the process there is that if a member wishes an issue raised on a policy matter at committee, they speak with the officer responsible for the committee. The officer says, yep, that's fine, I'll bring forward that report. Or if the officer says, no, I don't think that's a policy issue, or I don't want to bring, or I don't think it's appropriate to bring that forward, then a report goes to full council, and the council determines whether the report is to go to the committee or not. Can I say, I understand where Councillor Scobie is coming from. The practical application, because you have a maximum scheme of delegation, the standing order is meant to entitle members to have a delegated matter considered by the full council. All other delegated matters that are considered by committees is open to any member of the committee to make a motion on it. The practical application of what Councillor Scobie is suggesting may have ramifications which would make it almost unworkable. You have a situation where two members of the council could submit a motion asking for something that a committee has determined. Okay, the 6-month rule is a partial safeguard there, but you could have the situation where every decision taken by every committee is being revisited on the basis of a requirement of two members of the council. I am obtaining a council's opinion on a number of issues relative to proportionality, etc., on the council, and this issue is also being addressed by council in that respect. I've got to say, members, that the standing orders are written. You can't just read an individual standing order. You've got to read them all together. And I would just question the practicality. I understand what Councillor Scobie is trying to achieve, but I would just question the practicality of it. The council has a business to run. If you're going to be hanging about waiting to see if somebody's going to put forward a notice of motion to retract something that you've already agreed 6 months down the line, we're going to be in some difficulty from a practical business management point of view. And I'm not being disparaging. Councillor Scobie understands where I'm coming from. He and I have this debate long and hard. So I am not arguing with the member. I'm merely drawing council's attention to the practical application of it and also the legal implications.
Okay, thank you. Any members out? Rob?
Thank you, Chairman. Just in relation to Mr Haswell's reference to Council's opinion, am I right in thinking that, or did I understand him correctly, to have said that this suggestion is one of those that he's sought Council's opinion on?
Not on the direct suggestion, but I've sought council's opinion on a number of issues, and this is one which will give us some clarity on proportionality and the ability of members to recall decisions, the ability of members to participate in the decision-making process, where members don't automatically have the right to be on a committee. It also raises it's going to raise a real issue, and I think this has been raised in COSLA as well. If the law requires proportionality, which in Scotland it doesn't, but if it does require, as COSLA want it to do, what happens to cabinets and opposition, or cabinets and scrutiny panels? Cabinets are not based on proportionality.
Thank you. Tom?
I mean, I've got simply what he's saying, but I mean, I can go back in history and I know why 6-month rule was brought in, and if you recognise the council as having primacy, I know what used to happen 30 years ago in this Dale district, the whole lot of prefabs and 28 members present, they voted on the casting vote to knock the prefabs down, build new houses. 6 weeks later, the council met again, did a quick head count. Oh, so-and-so is missing. We'll take a vote. No, we're not going to knock them down. We're going to put shells about them. This went on for months and months. We left the council in a state of absolute flux, where a decision was made, but because that decision would be questioned by the full council at the next meeting, the decision was reversed. You couldn't progress it for a year until somebody's got together and put in a 6-month rule. You couldn't rescind the decision. Now, that was then adopted by the regional council, subsequently by this council. But I take on board what Alec's saying, because you could end up in the same state of flux that I've just referred to, that a committee could make a decision because you've then got a motion coming in wanting that decision reversed. The officers, they could proceed with the decision made by a committee because they've got delegated powers, but I suppose on advice you would be told, well, let it like, there's a motion coming into full council, therefore we better no proceed as we should. Now, if that's then got to be referred back to the next meeting of the committee, it's causing a delay again. I mean, if Alec's taking advice on this, I'm happy to perhaps go along with that for the moment. As it's stated there, standing orders do allow a member to request the proper officer for a report on a policy matter. Now, provided it's a policy matter that is not a negation of a policy already decided by that committee, there should be no reason to refuse it. that the officer should accept that and put that to the appropriate committee. If it's a report that negates a previous decision by that committee, it's proper that it's not accepted. So I think we need further advice in this one. I think Willie's request looks simple enough, but the more you look into it, it could just swap the whole process of managing the authority.
You, Richard?
Yeah, I think if we adopted that, I think the council would be less efficient, because the opportunity is there for any decision of a committee would have to go back to the committee if two members thought it was a good idea, didn't like it. So it takes a long enough time to implement decisions without putting another time barrier on it. I think members usually withdraw a delegation if there's a reasonable argument for that being done. As an objective person, I think that's my opinion. And there is, as I say, there's an opportunity to take policy matters to the committee.
Any members, any other questions, any other points you'd like to raise? Rob?
Thanks, Chairman. It was returning to the issue of the advice that Mr. Haswell had sought. I mean, it sounded as though there were things that were relevant to the work of this committee, so presumably it would be coming back to us at some point. In any case,
I'll certainly bring the advice I get back to the committee.
Go.
We don't make a decision on this, and we wait until we get that further information, and maybe look at other options as well that have been alluded to.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you've heard the debate. Willie, would you like to respond?
Thanks very much, Chair, for allowing me that opportunity. Could I say, Colin has gone right to the heart of it, where it might be easy. That this might be a messy route as to what I put before you, and it might be an easier way if you allowed committees, members to submit motions to committee, which currently doesn't exist in that. This is not about stalling or in any way affecting the efficiency of the council. This is about member involvement, member participation, and not entirely to say, let's get inefficient or block, because we still have, as Alex says, you've got to take it in how another standing order says, and we've got the standing order rule of the 48-hour. If a member is not, or members, at least 12 members, are not happy with a decision, that they can bring that back to full council. So there is always safeguards on both sides, both in terms of officer's role and member role. This is about allowing democracy to take place, and that it just doesn't get killed at birth, as I say. So I'm happy with what Alex is saying, that there are many things being looked at, or council's opinion is being sought, and I'd be happy to see council's opinion on this one as well, and for it to come back to your committee, Chair. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
I think another issue to remember is that the standing order that allows a member to request the proper officers for report and policy actually gives power to an individual member. And that recognises the right of an individual member to raise a point. And I think that's something that should not be forgotten. Now, they could ask for a point of policy to be raised even in a committee they are not on, and they could request to speak at that particular committee. Whereas if you wanted to consider motions at a committee, if you're an individual, you can't do that when you get a seconder, or if you happen to be a two-man group, it might be a committee in which you have no representation, in which case your motion would fall because you can't move or second that motion at a particular committee. So that's why I think it needs more thought.
Okay, thanks very much, members. I think there's a consensus swelling over here that we carry this over for the further information coming forward once council's been attained. Yep. Okay, thanks very much. Move on now to recommendation 2.5. I think it's appropriate we take 2.5 and 2.6 together. Members have any points they would like to raise on 2.5 or 6? And Okay, no matters arising. Colin?
I don't have a problem with what's described there in terms of the actual process. I think it makes sense. But in terms of the wider issue about involvement of members in local issues, we did change the member officer protocol previously, and I have yet to see how that actually works in practical terms, and that was in relation to the involvement of members in important ward issues. And there was numerous paragraphs added to the member officer protocol, and that protocol is right in my view, but where it falls down is when it comes to individual departments simply not following that protocol. And frankly, I know about other members, but there are numerous occasions, and I know other members have raised them time and time again, where major issues are developing in a ward, and there's no consultation whatsoever with the ward member on those issues. So it's fine to have the words, but it's the actions that are the problem, and we need to have more clear guidance to officers in relation to consultation with local members to avoid some of the issues that we've had in recent months.
Thank you. Mr Haswell?
I can assure Councillor Smith that clear guidance has been given on innumerable occasions to officers. 9 times out of 10 you discover that it's been a very junior officer who has started a ball rolling and it becomes a major issue before they know it, and they don't always follow the protocol. I can assure members that I'm regularly reminding heads of service and directors what the protocol says and when they should consult. And I know that members come to me and say, what the hell's going on? I haven't been told about things. Then I try to retrieve it. It's a cultural situation that we're trying to break. And it's some you can get to. It's a hearts and minds thing. I do take Councillor Smith's point. There's no point in having something written down if folk ignore it. So we are making a concerted effort within the Chief Exec service to make sure that services do apply the thing. So I do take Councillor Smith's point. I can't legislate for it apart from say, if you don't do this in future, I'm going to arrange for disciplinary action to be taken. And we're fast going down that line. Because there's no officer in Dumfries and Galloway Council can deny that they've had the document. They've all had the document.
Thank you. If members have no other points to raise, content with the content of Appendix 4. I've got no other business. Thanks very much for your attendance. Richard, sorry.
Some questions there in the report which we were to go through about names of committees and such like. Yeah. Some questions there. 4.421 and 422. 421, we had to make a decision, I think. Or recommendation.
Officers are coming back with a revised scheme on that, so that will be the topic or subject of a further paper. Okay. Well,
I'm quite happy to ignore the word policy, and if any member decides that they know what a good name for this committee should be, could they please let Claire know, and we'll incorporate it in the report.
okay, thanks members. I've no other business. Thanks for your attendance.